The war was over. The ruins of the Third Reich were still smoldering across Europe. In a gray interrogation room in a British POW camp, Captain B.H. Liddell Hart sat across from General Gunther Blumentritt. Blumentritt had been Rundstedt's chief of staff, one of the men who had planned the defense of Western Europe against the Allied invasion. Liddell Hart asked a simple question. "What did you think of Field Marshal Montgomery?" Blumentritt didn't answer with words. He stood up from his chair. The defeated German general began to walk across the small room, slowly, deliberately, placing one foot carefully in front of the other, looking down at the floor as if checking for cracks, for traps, for anything that might cause him to stumble. Then he stopped and turned to face the British historian. "He moved like this," Blumentritt said. That single demonstration, a German general physically mocking his conqueror, would capture something that official histories rarely admitted. The Wehrmacht had studied Montgomery for 3 years across 2 continents. They knew exactly how he operated. And they had a word for it. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt was the senior German commander in Western Europe. He had faced Montgomery from Normandy to the Rhine. When Allied interrogators asked Rundstedt to assess the British Field Marshal, his answer was precise. "Montgomery was very systematic," Rundstedt said. "That is all right if you have sufficient forces and sufficient time." The words sounded almost like praise. They weren't. Systematic, methodical, predictable. These weren't compliments from German generals who had built their entire doctrine around speed, surprise, and initiative. To call a commander predictable was to say you could plan your defenses around him. It meant you knew where he would attack. You knew when he would attack. You knew exactly how he would do it. But this raised an uncomfortable question. If Montgomery was so predictable, why couldn't the Germans stop him? The answer lay not just in tactics, but in the graveyards of the First World War. Montgomery wasn't just fighting the Germans, he was fighting the ghosts of the Somme, and revealing a truth the British public never wanted to hear. October 1942, the North African desert. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had been pushing the British back for 18 months. His Africa Corps had become legendary, fast, aggressive, always attacking where least expected. The British had cycled through commander after commander, trying to stop him. Then Bernard Montgomery arrived. Montgomery looked at the situation and made a decision that baffled his own officers. He refused to attack. For 7 weeks he sat at El Alamein building up his forces while Churchill raged at him, from London demanding action. Montgomery ignored the pressure. He waited until he had 230,000 men against Rommel's 80,000. He waited until he had over 1,000 tanks against Rommel's roughly 500, only about 200 of which were German panzers, equal to British armor. He waited until he had a 3-to-1 advantage in aircraft. Then, and only then, did he attack. The battle lasted 13 days. Montgomery ground Rommel's forces down through pure attrition. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't fast, but it worked. For British soldiers who had spent 2 years suffering defeat after defeat, this predictability wasn't a flaw. It was a promise. It meant they weren't being thrown into another meat grinder by incompetent leadership. Montgomery traded time for lives. Rommel retreated. And Montgomery's pattern was established. 2 months before El Alamein, Rommel had launched one final desperate offensive at Alam Halfa. Montgomery stopped him cold. Rommel's forces were broken, exhausted, out of fuel. His supply lines stretched across hundreds of miles of desert. A rapid pursuit could have destroyed the Africa Corps entirely. Montgomery refused to pursue. His commanders were stunned. The enemy was beaten and retreating. This was the moment to deliver the killing blow. Montgomery ordered his forces to consolidate their positions instead. Friedrich von Mellenthin was Rommel's intelligence officer. He analyzed the British halt and couldn't believe what he was seeing. The Germans had been given time to retreat, regroup, and establish new defensive positions. Von Mellenthin later wrote that the days of dashing cavalry charges were over. Montgomery had accepted that the British were not masters of mobile warfare. Instead, he had adopted a method based on the systematic destruction of the enemy by superior firepower. The Germans had a word for this kind of fighting: Materialschlacht, the battle of material, a war of attrition where the side with more resources simply crushed the other through sheer weight. It was the one game the Germans were guaranteed to lose. While Montgomery was grinding down Rommel in North Africa, another American general was about to enter the war. The Germans would learn to view him very differently. General Gunther Blumentritt had faced both men. When asked to name the most dangerous Allied general, he didn't hesitate. "We regarded Patton as the most dangerous," Blumentritt said. "He was a man of initiative and lightning-like action." The contrast was stark. With Montgomery, the Germans knew the attack would be frontal, massive, and inevitable. They could plan for that. With Patton, they had to hold reserves back because they couldn't predict his axis of advance. They never knew where he would strike next. The Germans respected Montgomery. They feared Patton. That distinction would cost the Allies dearly. The ultimate proof of German fear came before D-Day. For the invasion of France, Allied planners created an elaborate deception called Operation Fortitude. They created a phantom army group, FUSAG, and leaked intelligence that George Patton was its commander. The fictional force was positioned in southeast England, aimed directly at the Pas de Calais. The Germans took the bait completely. Their intelligence was convinced that Normandy was a diversion. The real attack, led by their most feared adversary, would come at Calais. Rundstedt and Rommel both agreed. The main effort will be led by Patton. They could not conceive that the Allies would sideline him for a diversion. The result was catastrophic for Germany. The 15th Army, one of their finest formations with 19 divisions, sat at Calais for 7 weeks after D-Day. They were waiting for Patton. Those divisions could have been thrown against the Normandy beachheads in the critical first days. Instead, they waited for an attack that would never come. July 18th, 1944. Operation Goodwood. Montgomery had promised a breakthrough. 3 armored divisions with nearly 900 tanks would smash through German lines east of Caen and race toward Falaise. It would be the largest armored attack in British history. But behind this massive wall of steel lay a fragile reality. By 1944, Britain was running out of men. They were disbanding entire divisions just to find replacements for the infantry. Montgomery knew that one major disaster, one encirclement, would break the British Army forever. He couldn't afford a gamble. Major Hans von Luck commanded Kampfgruppe von Luck, directly in the path of the assault. He had just returned from 3 days' leave in Paris when the attack began. The preliminary bombardment was terrifying. Over 2,000 Allied bombers dropped their payloads on German positions. The earth shook for miles. Von Luck's men huddled in their trenches waiting for the ground assault. Then the British tanks appeared, hundreds of them rolling forward across the open fields. Von Luck watched them advance and immediately saw the flaw. They moved as if on a parade ground, he later wrote. Dense formations, buttoned up tight, moving in straight lines, and, critically, no infantry support. The British tankers were blind and overconfident from the bombing. They assumed nothing could have survived that bombardment. Von Luck had a problem. The massive bombardment had disrupted his defenses. His anti-tank guns were scattered. But nearby, a Luftwaffe battery had 4 88mm anti-aircraft guns that had survived the bombing. The battery commander refused to engage the British tanks. His guns were for shooting down aircraft, not fighting ground battles. He didn't take orders from Army officers. Von Luck pulled his pistol and pointed it at the man's head. "Either you shoot at the tanks with your 88s, or I will shoot you." The Luftwaffe officer made the practical choice. The 88s opened fire on the advancing British armor. Tank after tank exploded. The dense formations that had looked so impressive became kill zones. British crews had no idea where the fire was coming from. Inside those tanks, the confidence of the morning turned into claustrophobic terror. The parade ground formation that looked so powerful on a map became a death trap in the field. And then, the moment that confirmed everything the Germans believed about Montgomery's army, the advance stopped. The British tanks didn't flank the guns. They didn't maneuver around the resistance. They halted and waited for orders. Von Luck's assessment was damning. The leadership was methodical but not flexible. They followed the plan even when the plan had obviously failed. Goodwood cost the British over 400 tanks. The breakthrough never came. Caen remained contested for weeks longer. September 1944. For once, Montgomery proposed something bold. Operation Market Garden would drop 3 airborne divisions behind German lines in Holland. They would capture a series of bridges, while British 30th Corps raced up a single road to link up with them. If it worked, the Allies would have a bridge across the Rhine and a clear path into Germany. General Kurt Student, the pioneer of German airborne operations, was coincidentally located just miles from the drop zones. When the massive airborne armada appeared overhead, he was genuinely shocked. They fell from the heavens, darkening the sky. But then Student's men captured Allied maps within hours of the drop. When he saw the plan, a single road, the entire operation dependent on one narrow axis of advance, he reportedly laughed. Field Marshal Walter Model initially thought the airborne drop was a commando raid to kidnap him. Once he realized it was a major offensive, he applied standard doctrine: contain the paratroopers and cut the road. He knew Montgomery wouldn't improvise a plan B. The ground relief force was 30th Corps, Britain's most experienced armored formation. They had to drive 64 miles in 2 days to reach the furthest bridge at Arnhem. The road was a single elevated highway. The Germans called it Hell's Highway. It ran through flat terrain with no room to maneuver. Any stoppage would halt the entire column. 30th Corps advanced at what one German officer called the standard Montgomery pace. When they hit resistance, they stopped to call in artillery rather than pushing through. They adhered to rigid timetables. They stopped at night rather than driving with headlights. The German assessment was brutal. A commander later noted that if they had driven like Americans, they might have made it. But they drove like British. The comment exposed the rigid spine of Montgomery's army. He had successfully trained initiative out of his commanders in exchange for absolute control. They followed procedures, not opportunities. At Arnhem, the British 1st Airborne Division was being destroyed. They held for 9 days waiting for relief that never came. 30th Corps was still fighting through resistance, miles to the south. For the men of the 1st Airborne at Arnhem, that agonizing slowness was a death sentence. As the hours ticked by and the sky remained empty of relief planes, the silence on the bridge became heavier than the shelling. Market Garden failed. The bridge too far remained in German hands. And Montgomery's one attempt at boldness had confirmed exactly what the Germans always believed about him. December 16th, 1944. The Germans launched their last great offensive through the Ardennes forest. The American lines buckled. Entire divisions were overrun. A massive bulge formed in the Allied front. It was the largest battle the American army would fight in the entire war. General Hasso von Manteuffel commanded the 5th Panzer Army, the main striking force. His intelligence officers calculated that it would take Patton's Third Army at least 96 hours to disengage and turn 90 degrees north into the German flank. Patton did it in 2. His divisions disengaged from their current operations, pivoted north, and drove through winter storms to hit the German southern flank. On December 26th, his forces broke through to relieve the surrounded 101st Airborne at Bastogne. Manteuffel was stunned. The Germans had expected to fight on their timetable. Patton had torn up their assumptions. While Patton attacked from the south, Montgomery took command of American forces in the northern sector of the Bulge. His first order was to tidy the lines. He pulled American units back from exposed positions, including the defense of St. Vite. It was tactically sound. It created a stronger defensive position. The Germans were relieved. By withdrawing, Montgomery gave the Germans territory, but he also bought certainty. They knew exactly what would happen next. Nothing. Not until Montgomery was ready. Manteuffel understood immediately what this meant. He could shift his remaining reserves south to fight Patton. The northern sector was frozen under Montgomery's methodical grip. No wild flank attack would come from that direction. Manteuffel respected Montgomery's defensive ability. He knew he couldn't break through once Montgomery took charge, but that was precisely the problem. The Germans didn't need to break through. They needed the Allies to be slow. The Germans called Montgomery a steamroller, slow, heavy, impossible to stop. But you could see it coming from miles away. They viewed Patton as a force of nature, striking from everywhere, moving faster than intelligence could track, impossible to predict where the next blow would fall. Montgomery never suffered a catastrophic defeat. Even when his offensives stalled, as they did at Arnhem and Caen, he never allowed his army to be destroyed. The Germans respected him for that. They had to. But respect and fear are different things. The Wehrmacht feared Patton because he denied them the one thing a soldier needs most: the ability to plan. Blumentritt's walking demonstration said it all. The Germans could match Montgomery's pace. They could prepare for each step. The difference shaped the final year of the war. Every week Montgomery spent building up for his next set-piece battle was a week the Germans used to fortify their next defensive line. Every month of a cautious advance was a month more men died on both sides. Montgomery's caution may have extended the war, but it also ensured there was a British army left to see the end of it. He was the general you wanted if you feared incompetent leadership more than the enemy. He wouldn't spend your life on a gamble, even if the alternative was a grueling war of attrition. Patton was the general you wanted if you needed the war over with, regardless of the cost. Was predictability a flaw or a strategy? The German generals had their answer. They respected Montgomery. They feared Patton. And that difference, respect versus fear, is the difference between a general who wins battles and a general who ends wars.